It's been nearly 50 years since the United States under President Nixon declared a war on drugs, which the US has never come close to winning. Under President Obama, there was an attempt to treat drugs as more of a public health issue and less of a criminal justice one. But President Trump now wants to build a wall to keep drugs out and has talked about designating Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations and even executing drug dealers. So, is the US war on drugs back with a vengeance, or has it already been lost for good? Joining me to debate this are Sanho Tree, Director of Drug Policy for the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and Derek Maltz, a former head of the Special Operations Division at the US Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me in the arena. Derek Maltz, the war on drugs has been a massive $1 trillion failure, has it not? For more than 4 decades, all it's given us is more war and more drugs and helped the US produce, I think, the world's biggest prison population.
Well, first of all, I never called it a war, number one. Number two is that if you lost a loved one to this epidemic, then you would be very happy that the DEA and other law enforcement agencies are out there trying to enforce the law. Unfortunately, this particular problem requires much more than law enforcement. And quite frankly, it's been neglected for many years. And hopefully we can get it back on track.
Just in terms of the law enforcement and the militarization aspect, when you look back on the last 4 or 5 decades of US policy from president to president, Democrat to Republican, do you have any regrets about the militarization of this problem?
No, I tell you, I worked in the Special Operations Division for 10 years with 30 agencies, 3 countries, NYPD and DOD commands. And not only is this a public health issue, it's a national security crisis, not just for America, for the world. And you know why, Mehdi? Because the terrorists are turning to criminal activities for their funding, and drug trafficking is generating $400 billion a year around the world. So it's becoming an easy funding mechanism for the terrorists. So I also witnessed the politics in Washington when they were hesitant about declaring the FARC and the AUC as terrorist organizations. And I've been a big proponent, the Colombian groups. I've been a big proponent suggesting that the Mexican cartel should be declared terrorists, and I can explain more.
We'll come back to that in one moment. Let me bring in Sanho Tree. It's a national security crisis, Derek says, so of course it has to be treated as a war, and especially if you've lost people to it, you would want the government to fight a war against people who've killed your kids.
This is primarily a public health issue first, and the problem created by drug trafficking is rooted in economics. So the idea of hitching a war on terror to the war on drugs, I think, conflates 2 very complex issues and gives you a one-size-fits-all solution, a bigger stick, more kinetic policies to really, kick butt.
Just to be clear for our viewers, you're not in favor of a bigger stick?
No, I'm not, because drug trafficking is based on economics. And when we're talking about things like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, these are essentially minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities that cost pennies per dose to produce. Where these things get such tremendous value for which people are willing to kill and massacre and fund revolutions or whatever is through the policies of prohibition. That amplify the value of these things astronomically. So the more we escalate the war on drugs, the more valuable the drugs become because we increase the risk premium that drug traffickers are allowed to charge the next person down the smuggling chain. That's how you turn a $1,500 kilo of pure cocaine from the streets of Medellin, Colombia, and by the time you get to the streets of Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia or New York, and by the time they cut it into little gram baggies, those dealers can get about $150,000 for that same kilo. This commodity snowballs in value because of our war on drugs. Absent that, these are basically pennies per dose to produce.
Why can't it be a public health crisis and a national security crisis? Why? Because at the end of the day, even if people agree with you at home and say, fine, that's true what he's saying about the drugs themselves, there are these cartels.
Yes.
We know transnational organizations, very violent, that do deploy terror.
Yeah.
Why not treat them as terrorist groups just as you would treat Al-Qaeda or anyone else?
There are terrorist groups that get some funding from drug trafficking, and there are criminal groups that also engage in acts of terror. But narcoterrorism is something that was constructed and popularized after 9/11, where the Bush administration declared Colombia to be the southern front in the global war on terror, even though the FARC in Colombia had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda.
Okay. Derek's shaking his head. Derek.
Well, first of all, I agree with Sanho's assessment on it's all about the money, right? So for the drug cartels in Colombia, the entrepreneurs, it's about making as much money as they can. And same thing for the Mexican cartels. But here's the issue. First of all, the war on drugs, I don't even like to use that term because it's not really a war. But I will say that going back to the Pablo Escobar days when he blew up an airliner with legitimate innocent people aboard, That's when we started seeing narcoterrorism, long before 9/11.
When people are listening to this around the world in particular, does it really make sense to replace the war on drugs with another failing war, the war on terror, which hasn't been very successful at beating terrorist groups? Al-Qaeda, etc., are still out there. It seems kind of weird that you would say, okay, we tried it this way. You don't want to call it a war, but it involved lots of militarization, definitely in Central America. And now we're going to try borrow what we did in Afghanistan or Iraq, which didn't turn out so well either. It seems like you're doubling down on failure.
Well, here's the deal. I just want to try to save lives. That's why I'm doing
I think everyone does.
Right. No, not everyone. There are people,
who doesn't want to save
there are
lives?
plenty of people that are disregarding the facts. Like, for an example, the Homeland Security Director of America is walking into Congress to educate them on what's going on the border. And they rudely interrupt her and get up and walk away. They don't want to hear it. You have to listen to the experts. Tom Homan, he's an expert who worked on the border. Brandon Judd, all of these guys. Mark Morgan, he's not even political.
Okay, isn't the problem, Derek, I mean, you're talking politics now. Isn't the problem here?
No, I don't want to talk politics, by the way.
Well, you just did. But this, on the issue of the wall, the border wall, Donald Trump, President of the United States, says that he wants to build a wall to stop, quote, an invasion of drugs.
Okay.
You talk about, you support that wall, I believe.
Well, can I tell you what I mean by that?
Okay, before you do, I'll just ask this question. Since you mentioned listen to the experts, most experts have come out and said a wall will not solve the problem of illegal drugs coming across the border.
I don't know what experts you're referring to, but here's what I would say.
Your colleagues in the DEA.
Okay, no, that's not true. They're twisting the words from the assessment that was made. So let me explain it.
The DEA,
the majority of the drugs from the major cartels come in through the port of entries. That's what they've said.
That's not what the president says, though.
But okay, I'm not speaking for the president. I'm speaking
He's the one building the wall.
Well, that's his decision. He's the president. But here's what I would say. The drugs that are coming in from the port of entry, we're not even hitting them properly because we don't have the resources there. The wall is going to help manage the flow of people and contraband to America. The wall is not going to solve the drug crisis in America. The wall will actually help the Border Patrol and the experts to get a better handle on it.
Okay, Sanho, Derek says the wall, it might not solve all the problems, but it'll help them get a handle on this problem at the border. What do you say?
The walls are Bronze Age technologies. There have been countermeasures to the wall going back many, many decades now. So the first thing they did was build ramps that could literally drive an SUV over the wall. They've got catapults, Roman technology, that can launch bales of drugs over the wall. They've got pneumatic air cannons. You've seen T-shirt cannons in sports stadiums. They have giant ones mounted on trucks and inside vans that can launch a 100-pound bale of drugs over that wall. There's narco submarines that can go around our port defenses. There are narco torpedoes now.
So it's not going to work, is what you're telling me.
There are 1,000 ways, and narco tunnels. And plus, the vast majority of drugs that come into this country from Mexico come through legal ports of entry.
Table that the majority, according to the evidence, the majority of illegal drugs come through legal ports of entry?
Exactly.
It seems like it, but I don't know.
That's what your colleagues at the DEA say.
I'm not listening to the colleagues at the DEA.
Why not? You told us to listen to the experts a few moments ago.
Okay.
Literally 2 minutes ago.
That's true. But here's the bottom line. The statistics and the information that's being portrayed in the public is not really accurate because they're twisting it. The DEA assessment, I agree with 100%. And in that assessment, they're saying the majority of the drugs are coming through the POEs.
What about the issue of, again...
And I agree with that.
What about the issue of, a lot of Mexicans would say, look, our country is demonized as being the kind of source of all this stuff. And, we talk about supply. But it's American demand.
Okay.
So you're building a wall to deal with supply. Yeah. What about the demand side?
Well, that's a great point. And I would say to anybody listening to me, when are they going to get their heads out of the sand and start dealing with the demand, dealing with the education, dealing with the treatment? I would be the first to tell you, and I think anyone in the DEA would say, law enforcement alone will not solve the problem.
Sanho, how do we deal with demand? What would you do if you could wave a magic wand and say, U.S. government, this is how you tackle the demand? But what would you say to do?
So many of our problems are rooted in issues of poverty, despair, and alienation. If you address those things, if you have a war on those problems, you solve a lot of problems downstream. I think opioids are very popular right now. And I think one of the reasons is that they allow this kind of a dream state. You can imagine better days. You could walk into your past and relive those great moments. Fits in with MAGA politics, right?
So here's a question.
People are yearning for those.
You're someone, correct me if I'm wrong, is it fair to say that you're someone who supports the legalization of marijuana?
Yes.
And other drugs, harder drugs as well?
I think those should be decriminalized and regulated to the extent possible. It's not just me. It's all 31 agencies. The United Nations came out in favor of decriminalization of possession.
So my question is, given we know that the opioid crisis is killing, 100 Americans a day, according to some statistics, those are legal drugs, prescription drugs in many cases. How does it help to bring more drugs onto the market, more legal drugs? How do you square the two?
People are the illicitly produced fentanyls and its analogs being injected into that supply of heroin and other opioids. That's what's killing people. And I think that Canada is doing something completely different from the U.S. So in Vancouver, they have a program where they have heroin maintenance. Up to 50 patients are allowed to import heroin legally from Switzerland, where they've used heroin and maintenance for hardcore, difficult-to-treat addicts. And they're allowing that in Vancouver, so that you take people out of the street scene where they're playing Russian roulette with fentanyl. It's a very dangerous scene in Canada. Plus, that are allowing local doctors to prescribe diluted prescription drugs
to be clear, then,
for people who are addicted.
So to be clear, despite the fact we have alcohol that's legal, ravages society in many ways, we know about the family breakdown, violence, public health problems associated with legal alcohol, you have the opioids issue, you don't think that legalizing more drugs will increase the sum total of societal problems?
I don't think criminalization helps at all. It doesn't help the people who are suffering, it doesn't help the victims, and it benefits drug traffickers. So what the drug war does, what prohibition does, is provide an indirect price subsidy, a price support for drug traffickers. Without it, they've got minimally processed goods to sell that aren't worth anything.
What about the US corporations? The big pharma that were pushing this stuff out. We've heard about the Sackler family that made a fortune from OxyContin, the prescription painkiller launched in 1996. The DEA is focused on Mexican cartels. Who's focused on the U.S. domestic companies that are pushing this stuff?
I live this nightmare. It's a very political issue because people in Washington that are supposed to be prosecuting these particular drug entrepreneur legal companies, they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to taint their names because they want jobs when they leave the Department of Justice. And that's what happens. So I agree with you 100%. We need to aggressively prosecute legitimate drug distribution companies when they're killing kids and they're not paying attention to the details. Now, I can tell you, because I lived it for 10 years when this exploded, that the drug companies were more interested, in my view, in making money than caring about the health and the well-being of citizens in America and other parts of the world. So I have a really strong opinion about that as well.
Okay. Sanho, I mean, when you look at what American companies have done in terms of the opioid crisis, do you think even people like yourself, quote unquote, on the liberal left end of the spectrum, talking about decriminalization, legalization, took your eye off the ball as well during this period?
I think the FDA did. So in the late 90s is when they begin this push to really promote OxyContin and these opioids, saying these new formulations aren't addictive, don't worry about it, when in fact they knew that this was a problem. And after people became addicted through prescription drugs, this kind of shifts around 2012. They are no longer getting addicted through doctors' prescriptions, but rather they're stealing and they're getting it from illicit sources. But around that time, the DEA began to crack down on pill mills and go after people, right, after prescribing doctors who are overprescribing. Well, when you already have a population that's dependent or addicted on these things, you suddenly cut off their supply. What are they going to do? It was utterly predictable. They went to the street and bought heroin, which was much cheaper. It's cheaper than a six-pack of beer sometimes. And then as the years go on, after 2012, a few years later, you start seeing fentanyl entering the heroin market. And so we've literally taken these people who were dependent, and some of them through doctors' prescriptions, and pushed them into the black market, onto the streets, where they're playing Russian roulette with extremely dangerous fentanyl. That helps nobody.
And last question to you, Derek. Given this problem at home, which you've identified yourself, you say you lived it, isn't it weird then to see a president of the United States right now obsessing over foreigners, walls, Mexicans, gangs, cartels, when you have all these US-made, homemade problems that are not being dealt with? Big pharma that's not being dealt with.
I'm a firm believer that if you're going to throw stones, you're not going to live. You shouldn't live in a glass house, right? We have to take care of our own first, and that's America and the addicted people. But the bigger thing is that the cartels. We talked about this narcoterrorism thing. Do you know the level of violence down there? They're cutting off heads, throwing them in acid pits, chopping off their legs and their arms. This is violence that we've never seen in this world, except with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the other terror groups. So something has to be done with that. We give the Mexicans a lot of money. So the question is, why are we giving Mexico so much money when they're not dealing with this problem. And so I got a major issue with the violence.
Sanho, last word.
But the wall, the idea of building a wall, Trump said it was to be a solid concrete wall. Then later on he says, okay, Border Patrol is right. We need slats in these walls so they can see what's on the other side. Well, when you have these 30-foot wall slats with 4-inch gaps, what's the first countermeasure you're going to do if you're a drug trafficker? 3.5-inch wide packaging. When a dose of fentanyl is a couple of grains of sand, imagine how much of that you can push literally hand through that wall.
On that note, Sanho Tree, Derek Maltz, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me in the arena.
Thank you.
That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.